Good evening and welcome to the October 28th, 2024 City Council Work Session. Thank you for joining us in this hybrid meeting format. For work sessions like this one, where there is no opportunity for public comment, those wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling into one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the public webcast and meeting materials web page. And even though we have a small but hearty audience here, I will just do the safety announcements, which is that in case of a medical emergency, the AED is on the wall there behind the staff. And in case of needing to make a quick exit, you can get out of the room through the glass doors that way, or get out of the room through the double doors in the back of the room. So not very eloquently described, but you all got the picture. So, and with that, thank you all for joining us. And I call this work session to order. And I guess, am I turning this over directly to Carrie? Thank you so much to talk about the police auditor selection process. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Good evening, Mayor and Council. My name is Carrie Baraldo, and I'm one of the interim co-directors for the Employee Resource Center. This work session is for Council to provide direction related to the selection components for the police auditor recruitment process. The information that I'm presenting this evening is based on the previous selection process for the auditor position, along with organizational best practice, and is intended to help inform Council's decision for the selection process. Before I jump to the selection process components, I'm just going to provide a brief overview on what is already in progress in terms of the recruitment. So the police auditor position is now currently open. City staff have updated the recruitment brochure and will start sharing that out to the multiple professional networks. ERC staff attended the Nicole Conference to network with experienced oversight professionals, and the contract with Bob Murray and Associates is in progress, and they will begin their outreach as soon as that is finalized. In terms of the selection process, the typical steps are minimum qualification screening, application submission screening, interviews, and then backgrounds and references. Next, I'll go into more detail for each of these, and then I'll finish with a proposed timeline that incorporates these steps while considering council break and available work sessions. In alignment with organizational practice, the first screening is to determine if candidates meet the minimum qualifications. Employee Resource Center staff will perform the screening as applications are submitted, and applications will be screened based solely on the minimum requirements that are outlined in the job description and reflected here on the slide. The next phase of screening is most often done by the hiring supervisor, so in this case would be council. Staff will provide council with a screening matrix in which they can rate candidates based on their application submission material, which includes a resume and cover letter. As part of the submission, candidates have been asked to provide their experience in performing administrative investigations, program development, and analysis, highlighting any specific law enforcement oversight experience. In addition, they're asked to provide any challenges or barriers they might anticipate to providing civilian oversight and why they're interested in the position. Council will provide their individual scores and ranking to the ERC, and then will compile those results. And those results will be provided back to council at a future work session so that you can determine how many candidates and whom you'd like to be invited to interview. Sorry, I think I skipped ahead really quick. That's okay. Next, I'm going to go through the various interview panels. And as a reminder, the components I'm recommending are very similar to steps that were done during the last recruitment, and they align with organizational best practice. The various panels and participants allow for balanced community and stakeholder participation while providing council the flexibility to consider this input along with your own experience. There are 3 specific panels that I would recommend for the interview process. So starting first with a presentation and Q&A forum with a community panel. For this, each candidate would be asked to share a brief oral resume on themselves and to answer a specific question to be determined by council at a future work session. The remaining time will consist of the candidate taking and answering questions that are submitted in advance by the community panel members. City staff would facilitate this forum, and the participating community members will be asked to complete written feedback for each candidate, and that information would be shared back to council and the mayor to inform their decision-making process. Next would be a stakeholder panel. For the stakeholder panel, each candidate would participate in a structured interview. Interview questions would be developed by the ERC after soliciting input from a variety of stakeholders, which may include the current interim auditor, auditor office staff, individual touch points with counselors, and incorporating questions that were used from the last recruitment process. Those questions will be approved by council at a future session. Following this interview, ERC staff would compile the scoring and feedback from the panel, and that would be shared with council at the conclusion of their interviews. Last panel is a chance for each candidate to participate in a structured interview that includes the opportunity for follow-up questions and discussion with city council and mayor. Interview questions again would be developed by the ERC with final approval by council in a future work session. Following the interviews, ERC staff again will share all of the feedback collected from all of the other panels and will document council's discussions and decisions. And then lastly, while not an interview, this is an optional activity that would be unrated or not scored, but it's given as a courtesy to candidates to help inform their decision regarding relocation to Eugene, which is often a component that we include when we're recruiting for higher level positions within the city. Now I'm going to go over the timeline briefly. This timeline is intended to capture items for council in particular. So as a reminder, the recruitment's open between now and January 1st. The ERC will be reviewing those applications as they come in to determine if a candidate meets the minimum requirements. The ERC would then compile those applications for the candidates that meet the minimum requirements and provide that to council along with screening criteria on January 6th. Council would be given 9 days to complete their review. This timing has council starting on the review before returning completely from break on the 12th. This timing is necessary in order to have sufficient time to compile the information and then provide back to council in time for the January 29th work session. And then I would also note that we will have 2 newly elected officials onboarding in January, and staff can arrange time in advance to meet with them and get them. At the January 29th work session, council will have the opportunity to review and finalize the candidates that will move forward to interviews, along with the interview questions that I referenced when I talked about each of the different panels. And it could also be an opportunity to approve a list of panel participants should you choose to do so in a work session. Directly after that work session, we would have a list of candidates that you all would want to invite to interview, and we're looking at a tentative dates for those interviews to occur the week of After all of the panel interviews are concluded, council will use all of the panel scores, feedback, and ratings to determine if they have a candidate that they would like to move forward to the next step in the process, which is a full police background / references. It encompasses both. Council would be provided with a full background memo and then would have the opportunity to discuss and approve appointment of the candidate in a work session that would take place early to mid-March prior to spring break. So at this point, I'll turn it back to you, Mayor, for discussion and for council to consider the following options based on the information that I provided.
Okay, thank you very much. There are a couple of places for action for council. So are there questions about anything related to the process? Randy.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Carrie, for the presentation and the information. Are you going to, is HR going to recommend how many people we bring in for interview, or is that kind of a preset number, or is it just based on, as we go through the information?
Typically, I wouldn't suggest a preset number. That may, usually what you're looking at is when we compile rankings and scoring, looking at the candidates, and then council would have the opportunity to determine a cutoff point of how many people that they would want to move forward. I did note usually you can incorporate about 5 interviews in a day because candidates are moving from panel to panel. So if you're looking at more than 5, we would have to span 2 days. And that could get a little bit trickier with timing and availability.
Thank you. That's kind of what I was getting at there. So
Yep.
appreciate that. This next I've got three pieces of information I would like to see as part of council leadership that's going to have to be deciding this. But since really the whole council is the hiring board, I think it would be good to share with all of us. One of them is a list of who was selected to serve on the last selection panels and their affiliations, so we kind of get an idea from that. The next is a list of current CRB and Police Commission members. So we see who we have there. I don't know if you keep lists of community members that are, have participated in past processes or people that have been active in the community. I'm sure we all have some ideas around that too, but it'd be interesting to see what you have on that. And then a basic overview of the last process. Is it similar to this one, or were there differences on that?
Okay. I can speak to the last, and then I could work back. Yes, very similar. So I built this process very similar to what happened in the 2009. So these were the same panel groups that were identified, and then the suggested groups that you would include were also pulled from that. So not exact people, but the community groups were pulled from that. So yeah, it is modeled.
Okay, great.
And we absolutely have a list of folks that we use. I can think of, for council in particular, you have 3 other employees and you do evaluation processes every year. And so we're often surveying those folks. So I think I would be able to provide a list of folks.
Then I'll include my other category. Anything else that you think would be relevant and helpful to us as a body that will ultimately be the hiring authority that would help us make a decision would be appreciated.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Greg?
Carrie, if we can go back to slide number 4, the third bullet, the last bullet on there was the police auditor must have 5 years of progressive, responsible experience overseeing and performing administrative investigations and performing program development, analysis, and complex professional staff support, preferably in the public sector, and a bachelor's degree in a related field. A Juris Doctorate is preferred. So why, let me ask you this question this way. What are the educational or experience equivalents that we would be considering that would be less than a Juris Doctorate? So we wouldn't be hiring an attorney per se, but we're looking at someone with a bachelor's degree and a master's, or are we looking at somebody who has worked in the field for 10 years, for example, and has, you know, some present knowledge about police internal investigations and not necessarily having the academic equivalencies that, you know, we would prefer in this role?
So from a standpoint of just meeting the minimum requirements, so that's like your entry point into
Right.
being able to be eligible.
First cut.
Yep, it's a bachelor's degree, 5 years. You can consider an equivalent if someone does not have a bachelor's degree. They would then have to have, usually what we're looking at is at least, you're usually like 7.5 years of experience to equate for that bachelor's degree. So we could look at something like that. Beyond minimum qualification screening, you all could consider having a certain level of experience or a certain master's degree as something that you want to consider when you do your application screening. So, right, candidates who have, maybe they don't have a JD, but they have a master's in a related field, maybe you want to give them a type of preference or additional points. Does that make sense to say we would consider that?
Yeah, the other thing with that would be, would we be looking at, say, an ex-police officer with 15, 20 years of experience but doesn't necessarily have a degree?
You could consider that if you want to consider an equivalency. If you want to have the experience count as equivalency towards the degree, that is something that is organizational practice that we look at.
Okay.
Okay, other questions, comments? If not, I think you can put the first motion on the table.
Great, thank you, Mayor. Move to approve the timeline and plan presented in this work session.
Second.
Any other final comments? All in favor, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That passes unanimously. Okay, thank you. And then the next one?
Move to authorize council leadership to develop a list of panelists and participants to be submitted to council in a memo with an opportunity for council to schedule a work session to discuss the list if desired.
Second.
Further questions or comments? All in favor, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and that passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Very clearly, and council's ready to move forward, so appreciate all of that and your presentation. Thank you. So our next item is going to be an update from the city manager, so I'll turn it right over to you.
Thank you. I know we like to always have an opportunity to do this, especially if we have a work session that drops off and if we have a topic or a project that is front of mind for you or for the community that I can just give you an update on. And we've done it periodically around a couple of projects. So tonight, I thought because we had a work session opening, I could take an opportunity to give you an update and just talk a little bit about the Eugene Clean Fuels LLC project that's been proposed out in the Bethel area. So my plan is just to talk a little bit about the project, the zone verification, and try to answer a couple of the questions that Councilor Leach asked around what the city's role is, what the council's role is, and then I can say a little bit more about next steps and timeline. But I want to preface all of that with reminding everybody that in my role, the city manager's role is very neutral. We're looking at code, we're trying to apply, very clear criteria and making a call and a decision about things outside of whether any one of us thinks a project is good or not good. And we do this every day. It's part of the job. But I think it's important because as there's been more communication, and especially in the neighborhoods and some of the pressures, I don't want people to feel like we've slipped into a place of being political, because we haven't. So let me just say a little bit about the project description. I'm just going to read a few sentences from some materials they submitted. And then I also had a meeting with them earlier today, and I can use some of that too. So they're proposing to construct a clean fuels transloading facility on existing Union Pacific Railroad yard in Eugene, Oregon, leasing an area within one of the parcels that's on the map. I've handed out 2 maps to you. One of them is the one that doesn't have the colory aerial photo is the one that they submitted. And then because there was that blank spot at the bottom, we added in a little bit just so you could see the proximity to Train Song Park and you would know where you are in Eugene when you look at that. So they're planning, that space they're looking at as land they would lease from Union Pacific. The project is the green and the lines in the middle. The facility will be operated up to 24 hours per day, 7 days per week, with approximately 70% of truck trips anticipated between the hours of 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. to avoid high-volume traffic times. Development of the facility would add 3 railroad tracks, 2 truck loading spots to transload clean advanced biofuels, which is renewable diesel, ethanol, and sustainable aviation fuels, directly from rail cars into trucks for more efficient delivery to local retailers than the current supply chain. The person online today from the company described it essentially as a large gas station without underground tanks. So that, if you're trying to understand how it would operate. A lot of history and information and background on why they're doing this and what they're trying to do in terms of providing clean fuels to the area, and doing it by rail instead of by trucking, which lowers greenhouse gases. I'm not going to go into all that. It was mostly because that really wasn't relevant to whether it's allowed or not allowed. So what they had applied for was a zone verification. So I've got a lot of different papers there because I am definitely in other people's expertise on this. And a zone verification itself does not allow or deny a particular use of a property. It simply evaluates whether a proposed use is permitted outright and then would only require building permits, or whether additional land use applications are required, and/or if special standards must be met before the use is approved. So we, as you know, we issued a zone verification saying it was an allowable use. You heard about a lot, we heard about it a lot, and in my asking questions of trying to understand the land that's outside of the city limits but inside the UGB and what we're doing for Lane County, in all of those questions, I just felt strongly that we may have made the exact right decision, but before we go down this path of this appeal, I want to make sure we've made the exact right decision. And the process allows for us to withdraw that and reconsider, and that's what we've done. We have 90 days to do that. So when I talk about the city's role in the urban transition, it really is, again, this is land that is inside the urban growth boundary, outside the city, so it's technically, all of those lands fall to Lane County. We've had an agreement since 1987 that the city reviews and does the land use work on all of those properties, and we do that applying a code that was, it's an urban transition code that was voted in by the county. So it's the county's code that we're kind of administering. So there's some interesting complications with railroad right-of-way being considered unzoned and what can be used there, what can be done there and what can't be. So that's, why we're going to take a little bit more time. So our role, the city's role is really to determine, to apply those standards as adopted by the county and to apply the codes that have been adopted by the city wherever that is possible. And what the council's role in that, if it comes down to the council's role in making a land use determination or a building permit determination, you wouldn't have a role in that. It's possible down the road that you would have some other code amendment type rule. I don't know if it would be related to this, but you have the right, you have the ability to put in place public health overlay zone, that kind of thing, although it wouldn't apply in this space. So one of the things I'm trying to understand also is how would you, how is that going to work as we go forward with the public health overlay zone when we get into these areas that are also overlapping the county lands? So right now what we're doing is, it's only been a week, so the staff are reviewing, Lauren, our city attorney, is reviewing and, trying to determine what that next step is and what our final decision will be. In the meantime, I know that the company and their associates have met with several folks. They've met with the community, they've met with us, and I know they intend to continue probably after we make another call. I'm not sure how much they're going to interact during this kind of, until we make another decision. So looking back at Lauren to see, did I miss anything? Okay. When you start to ask the questions, she's probably going to end up at the table. Mike is welcoming you already.
Okay, yeah, so Mike is definitely first in the queue here. Did you also, were you asking? Yes, and Randy, okay.
Assuming, and I know this is a big assumption, but I'm just preparing for the potential eventuality. Presuming everything checks out, they get approved to build and do this thing, and it goes into operation. What or which, if it's more than one, government agency would have primary regulatory authority over their operation?
After it's built.
My microphone on? This is my okay. That is a great question, Councilor Clark, and one that I do not know the full answer to. I think that they are probably regulated by a number of different government agencies on various
Federal
levels.
level too,
Yes.
and state, that's
Yes.
why I'm asking.
And so that's something that I'll need to get back to you on.
The last part, sir.
I would need to get back to you.
Guesses that I won't hold you to? DEQ, I can make that guess,
Well,
but
yeah, I think they've identified that they have, LRAPA, federal regulations, DEQ. I think there's a whole list of of folks that regulate fuel. Okay, mine's on. Okay.
And I'm usually the one saying that to somebody else, so I'm very sorry. And for those at home, I just asked who had primary regulatory authority if this gets
And
built.
when it's built.
Because, and I will tell you why I asked the question. In my opinion, and I may be alone, you know, I'm used to that, it happens sometimes. J.H. Baxter was primarily a regulatory failure in our community. There were agencies with regulatory authority to make sure that people around them were safe, and it didn't work. So I don't want, whether or not we have an overlay zone or don't, or at what point in the future that we do, I want to make sure that this time, we know who has primary regulatory authority for the safe operation of such a site if it gets built, and some way that we have regular communication or some way that we have regular contact to be able to predict or to try and minimize any potential issues that may come along. So I will look forward to your communication on that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Randy and then Alan.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, City Manager, for the introduction to this, and I appreciate you, Lauren, being at the table. I share a lot of Councilor Clark's concerns about this. You know, I look at this map here, already understanding where this is and knowing that this facility is going to have thousands of gallons of highly volatile, low flash point fuel that puts off flammable vapors at a very low temperature. So it's always going to be a hazard, and I look at the proximity to the neighborhood, that does concern me. To answer part of your question, Councilor Clark, the Federal Railroad Administration has a lot of authority over this, but they are understaffed. And the Federal Railroad Authority or Administration is a subset of the Federal Department of Transportation. And I know this because I've dealt with them before. The other piece where I really, when I look at this, my big question is, what authority do we have over Bethel Drive, which is a city street, and the access point in and out? That's where, based on what I know, that's where I think we have most of our teeth. And so how do we control, Bethel Drive is an unimproved street. I don't know that the base is substantial to hold up to 40 semi-tractor trailer rigs coming through there a day, in and out. And I'm just curious what authority we have over our city street.
So I just want to say, we're going to catalog all the things you're asking so we can be answering. Both of these questions are, if it is actually allowed in this land use and they go to build it, then what would be those standards? And we do have some control over what can happen with access to and from our streets, but we haven't gotten that far because even today, the project's shifting a little bit, so even today, the owner's reps were talking about doing more of the in and out through the space closer to 99. So if indeed it is allowed and they are coming in for permits, then we would be working through all of that and doing exactly what you're asking.
Thank you. So at the permit phase, is that where we see the actual site plan to understand what the diking will look like? Do they have remote foam introduction ports where our firefighters, in the case of a fire, can apply AFFF without getting right up next to it? These are all things that are going to be extremely important, and I know that fire will be involved in that as well. But, you know, I hear the neighbors' concerns. I hear some of the advocates' concerns, and quite frankly, I share them myself. Again, I know what can happen at these places, and they do happen in other parts of the country. So anyway, I will be looking at this very closely, and I just want to know what we can do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Alan?
Thanks. Can you explain the two charts that you?
Yeah, so, well, the first one, are you talking about the maps?
Yeah.
The first one is the map that they gave the city when they were having their project consultation. And the second one, and I wanted you to have it just so you knew, this is the site plan that they provided. The other one just has some additional context of the neighborhood because I felt like I was having a hard time understanding where it was. And if I was, I thought you might too. So the addition of a little bit more lets you see where Transong Park is, so you kind of know exactly where you are on Bethel Drive.
Where would the tanks be located?
They wouldn't have underground tanks. So they, I
wouldn't
think the
be any
project
tanks?
includes a large area that can contain the spill. If they spill, it can contain it. But it will be directly, as I understand it, they have a large manifold that goes directly from the tanker to the truck. So the semis pull in, they get loaded with fuel, and they pull out.
So no tanks on site?
I don't believe so. I think the tanks are the cars. Yeah.
And I mean, this is pretty obvious, share the concern with this residential neighborhood right there. One of the things I heard was, why don't they just move this thing north where there's not a residential neighborhood? Maybe put it on the other side of the tracks instead of on Bethel's Ave side. Is that something that the company's considered? Because then it's more in an industrial area and. Yeah, but there, on the other side of the tracks, there's also some space. Is that a consideration?
They didn't bring that up today. We asked why this spot, and I don't think they actually really answered that. I don't know if they've said that, if they've evaluated that in any of the meetings you've been in. I'm looking at Counselor Leach,
Because it's right across the street from a neighborhood, residential neighborhood, which is the concerning part, I think, among other many concerns. But, and that, is this a fuel facility or a railroad facility?
that's part of what I think we're trying to evaluate.
'Cause that would help, right, to determine who regulates it, I would suspect.
It's my understanding that the Eugene Clean Fuels folks are leasing. It's my understanding that the applicant is leasing space from Union Pacific. So it's railroad right-of-way, but the facility will be Eugene Clean Fuels facility.
It's on railroad property. And, yeah, and my dealings with the railroad is, as far as I can tell, they're basically almost a sovereign nation. They have their own set of rules about everything and pretty much excludes our regulatory issue, powers. And we found that out in the coal trains issue a bunch of years back, that it's almost impossible to regulate them. Okay, so it'd be good to know who's the regulatory agency on this. I know the PC does regulate some railroad stuff related to safety, but fuels is a whole different thing. Probably a cross-jurisdictional regulatory scheme. That would be good to know. But in the end, if I understand this all correctly, because this is railroad property, because our zonings don't apply, our rules don't apply, our overlays don't apply, and there's very little regulatory constraints that we can place on this piece of property. Kind of basically, because it's a railroad.
I think that's a fair statement, but also because it is located outside of the city limits. So city staff is making the decision on this zone verification application because of the intergovernmental agreement we have with Lane County for land use and building permit services in that area outside of the city limits, but within the urban growth boundary. But we're applying a code that's adopted by the county. So any changes to that code are really up to the Board of Commissioners, wouldn't be up to the City Council, and the city code provisions only apply within the city limits, not on property outside of the city limits, which this is.
But it's within the UGB?
It is within the UGB.
And so what distinguishes this? We're going to talk about some annexations coming up in the meeting after this. And there's triggers to annexation. This wouldn't trigger an annexation of this property?
That's a great question. My understanding is no, but I can do a little bit more and ask staff to do a little bit more digging on that as well.
I'm not sure that would matter much, but.
Okay, Jennifer and then Greg.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. Thank you all for coming here and talking about this. It sounds like it's a little early still in the process and very complicated, so I appreciate you coming and giving us an update. I'm sure you know everyone's so curious. And I know it's hard to come when you don't have all the answers, so I appreciate you taking the time. And I'm also glad you pointed out that the city's role, staff, is to be neutral. And there are rules, and you apply the rules, and you don't pick favorites. But luckily, that's what we're here for. I kind of see as a role, as a foil to that, is that, we can have those opinions about what is appropriate and what's not appropriate. And in my opinion, this is not appropriate next to these people who have homes and gardens and families and pets. And so as we're getting more information and looking at our options, we may not get to have a say. We may not be able to say no. No, thank you. Please go somewhere else. But it would be nice to get as much information, like Mike was talking about, of what our options are. What and I want to say weak points are, but where are the places that we can put some pressure, or we can demand certain expectations and find consequences if they are not met? Because not only the dangerous parts of this, but just the noise and the constant cars going to, I cannot imagine having to live next to this. So, and I really appreciate it. This sounds like it's a lot of work, and I look forward to our next meeting when you guys have dug into it a little more. Thank you.
Thank you. Greg?
Yeah. The mayor and Lindsay and I were at a community meeting about a week and a half ago about this particular situation, and Councilor Groves is right. Going back to 1862 and 1864, in the Lincoln administration, the Railroad Acts were passed, and that gave the railroads 5.2 million square miles of right-of-way that cannot be touched by government regulations, so they can move whatever they want there. So a couple of questions come to mind off of this. One of them is coming from that meeting, and that is there an evacuation plan for the neighborhood should something go, completely off the, for lack of a better, off the rails? This is what happened in Ohio, in, my home state with Norfolk Southern, and they had a big spill, and, there's still people that are arguing about that particular situation. So what responsibility would either Clean Fuels or the Union Pacific bear for making sure that the residents across the street are safe? And then, I don't know whether Councilor Leach has had this conversation or not, but there's also the people who are in that industrial park to the north, closer to Highway 99. And, if you drive down Bethel Drive, that, it can barely hold on to a regular 2,000-pound car, let alone, thousands of pounds of trucks with flammable liquids going through there 24 hours a day, or what we were told was, they would only be running between 6 at night and 6 in the morning. That's, 40 trucks up and down there, and then, where do they let out at? Is it Roosevelt? Is it Highway 99? Exactly where are those trucks going to be going in the community, and what areas are they going to be servicing? What businesses are they going to specifically be servicing?
They did say today that based on a meeting they had last week, they're creating 2 maps. One is a map of where they're receiving fuels from, and the other will be a map showing where they're going to be distributing locally, because they said local, and I think you've asked some other questions. Some of the materials I saw was a 30-mile radius, but they have not given those maps yet.
And they have different fuels that they're going to be transporting. So some of it is airplane fuel, some of it, may be gasoline, some of it may be other fuels that, I guess I'm out of time. I need a second round.
Okay, thank you. Matt?
Thank you, Mayor. I have a whole host of environmental concerns, but a lot of them have been brought up, so I'm going to hone in on livability and public safety. And Councilor Evans highlighted something that caught my attention. More than 40 trucks, 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. is not insignificant. So from a livability standpoint, that's cause for alarm. But the public safety piece, it's my understanding that Union Pacific doesn't have a very good track record, pun somewhat intended, when it comes to providing for public safety. And I can think of just downriver from here, what's known as Mario Land, unhoused camps that are routed every year or so by UP when they come down, because they have essentially one public safety agent for the entire state, and they come in and somewhat heavy-handed will bulldoze an area and often compact the refuse and the camp to the ground. It's adjacent to the river. Not a very good track record. Is it the city's understanding that UP has one public safety liaison or one public safety officer for the state, and would UP be point on public safety at this proposed fuel loading zone?
I don't have the answer for that. I've heard the same information you have about one person regulating the tracks for camps, but I don't know if that applies to all public safety and all of their regulatory needs. We would have to follow up.
Thank you. I'd be interested to know, similar to the other questions that have been brought up about whose point in regards to, from a regulatory point of view, I would want to know whose point from a public safety point of view, and what that capacity looks like.
And just to be clear, these are all good questions that we want to provide information on any good project, but it won't weigh into whether it is allowable under the zone or not.
Right. But it may or may not inform this body to then advocate to the county commissioners, who would be the ultimate decision maker one way or another.
The county is not the ultimate decision maker on the zone, right? We're operating under an urban transition agreement that we would have to give a year's notice to get out of and say, take it back. We'd have to give a year's notice. So we are the ultimate final decision makers on this. The county could be, if you wanted to approach the county about changing the code, changing the zoning, or not the zoning, but changing the code, or how you want to work with them on the public health overlay, I think it'll certainly be beyond 90 days of when we have to say, yes or no, we believe it is allowable.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mike, did you want a second? Lindsay, anyone who hasn't had a first, I think? Okay. Do you want a round? Okay. Mike, go for it.
Thank you, Mayor. You started there on my questions, and first of all, I just want to do another question to confirm if I heard you right, and everything I've read is correct. This is all a biofuel transfer station. There are no petroleum-based fuels that are being loaded or unloaded through this facility. Is that correct? Biofuels are non-petroleum-based fuels.
They are.
So it's only biofuels, there's no petroleum-based fuels being transferred here, right?
Got airplane fuel going through.
They run a percentage
Yeah.
of biofuel. It's mixed with petroleum products. For example, our fire apparatus, I'm not sure what level they run now, but it used to be B20, which meant 20% biofuel.
They're not, but they said today they're not doing any mixing here. It's not mixed. It's not blended. Yeah. You're getting into like details of the fuels industry that I don't have.
Okay, cool, excellent, fine. And so now 190 agreements, which I assume is what you're saying these are, and then from your nod, I'm assuming I'm correct. So it was always my understanding, and maybe I'm wrong, that 190 agreements come into play after a determination has been made whether or not a permit is required, at which point you have to annex into the city before the city can act. Am I incorrect on that?
That's not correct. This is, and Lauren, jump in if I'm wrong. I mean, we have a lot of 190 agreements with the county. This one specifically is regarding our, we apply their urban transition code to the urban transition area, which is the area outside city limits, but inside the UGB. There is no trigger of only once a permit is required or anything like that. The IGA is broader than that.
Does the IGA leave room for commissioners to overrule, to change process once the city has engaged on a question?
Not that I'm aware of, but speak to it, please.
Not within the bounds of this current IGA. It would need to be amended.
Could you just clarify for anyone who might be listening what a 190 agreement is?
So intergovernmental agreements, ORS 190 is a chapter of the Oregon Revised Statutes that allow governmental bodies to contract with each other to do the services for one governmental entity that they could be doing for themselves. And so in this case, we have an intergovernmental agreement, which we commonly refer to as IGAs, between the city and the county, in which we, the city, have agreed to implement their urban transition code, which is adopted by the County Board of Commissioners for this area of property. So we issue the permits on their behalf within the urban transition area. We do these zone verifications, and we do all of that.
They can't afford as vigorous a planning department as we have.
Yeah.
Well, the nature of my question is just about, I guess, it is all about the 190, because it's all about the IGA there and whether or not there's any question of authority, because this stuff is really close to homes, but it's county. So none of this is us later, and we're gonna hear about it, and I just would hate to see a decision that the city does one thing and the county commissioner majority might feel a different way, and, that's not gonna be possible, that's what I'm hearing?
Well, it would not be possible under the IGA for them to overrule us, if that's what you're saying. They can say, we don't like how you are managing our urban transition area, and we're giving you notice that we're terminating this.
And a year later.
And we could come to a mutual agreement. That's if termination, and we're like, we want to keep it. But we could say, well, we'll mutually agree to terminate earlier than the 1 year. But there's not a provision within this process where we issue a decision and the Board of County Commissioners says, no, actually, the decision is
Okay,
this.
thank you very much.
Any other questions or comments? Lindsay, did you want to speak? Alan, you want a second round? Okay, go for it.
But the only decision that the city makes is basically on the building permit and whether or not they met the building life safety code issues on the structure. Other than that, there aren't any other city decisions, and that's objective. It's either you did or you did not meet those code requirements for the structure, right?
If it is determined that it's allowable, it's an allowable use, yes.
Then it's just building permits. And what would make it be not allowable use?
So in a more general case, we would look at the zoning of the property, and there's a list of allowed uses in the zone, and we would say, yep, it's on the list or it's not on the list. In this particular case, because it's railroad right-of-way, it is unzoned, so we don't have a zoning designation to look at, but there is a provision in the urban transition code that says, that lists the allowed uses for railroad right-of-way, including the movement of rolling stock. And so that is the question. What does the movement of rolling stock mean? What is rolling stock? Is that just trains moving on through? Does that incorporate other uses, et cetera?
I think because part of what happened and what I said to the owners today is there were different descriptions of what the project was based on whether they were doing their project consultation, which may have been more detailed, or their zone verification, which I think was less detailed. And so trying to determine whether they hit the mark, whether the project hits the mark on all of the things that are allowed in the railroad zone was a question to me on Friday. I couldn't quite totally see it, and I felt like we had a little bit of time to just take another look. And so we're looking at all of the pieces that are in there. That's what we told.
And the fact that it's unzoned means we can't impose any zone on it. And that goes back to 84 and the rules around railroads. But it had, if it were a disaster were to happen here, the impacted area would be, that doesn't matter to our ability to deal with this facility? Or is that a state and federal issue?
So Councilor Zelenka, I think what you're asking is if something were to go wrong, the majority of the impacted area is actually within the city limits. From a land use perspective, no, that doesn't make a difference in terms of the city's authority to impose its land use regulations outside of the city limits. But maybe going back to Councilor Clark's question and your question about other levels of regulatory authority, there may be others that are more encompassing.
I mean, the only plus to this thing is that it's renewables fuels, and they have much lower carbon intensity than petroleum products, and therefore they have a greenhouse gas benefit. But Randy, maybe you can answer this question, but they still burn.
Ethanol burns.
Yeah, and it's that's irrelevant in terms of a disaster, okay? Thanks.
Okay, I have Greg for a second round and then Mike for a third round.
Thanks, Mayor. So I'm going to go back to the structure of Bethel Drive. And could we or would we, require them, if they're going to be moving this cargo up and down Bethel Drive, could we or would we require them to be able to reinforce that road or rebuild that road? Because structurally, that road is not going to be able to handle that kind of traffic. And I'm no expert on this, but I can, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that, Bethel Drive is a 2-lane road that's unimproved, that has no drainage, no sidewalks, nothing. I go down that road all the time. It's my shortcut going home. So it's problematic from several standpoints, plus the public safety standpoint.
So when we get to the building permit stage, if all of the things, say we come back to the same exact resolution we did before and it's an allowable use and they're going through that, then the council won't be able to impose those kinds of restrictions. But when our team looks at it, when Public Works looks at it from a stormwater, wastewater, transportation, we may have additional things that are required as part of the project, and that's not uncommon with a large project. But we're not there yet.
Would we be looking at pieces of an EIS for this project? Environmental impact statement or something on that level through the feds? I mean, when I was on the LTD board, we had to go through an EIS process and a NEPA process to do the MX projects. And so I kind of equate this to some degree with that level of environmental responsibility and detail that, since we would be looking at these vehicles running up and down Bethel Drive and then through our community, shouldn't there be some kind of environmental analysis?
I assume that that's part of getting a permit to do all of this with the railroad, that they have to go through that. That's not part, we're not permitting we're not
yeah.
permitting the gas station-ish part of it. We would be permitting the like restroom facility and concrete holding area, but the environmental impact would be on the entire operation, and that would be work that I assume we can ask them if they're having to do that.
I
Don't
mean,
typically
I think that that's important, given the proximity is to the neighborhood and, what could happen extended, if there is an accident or some kind of incident that would, trigger some things that we don't want to see happen.
Okay, thank you. I actually have Randy for a second round, and then we'll get back to you, Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. Do we know what Bethel Drive, what the street is designated as?
I don't know off,
Residential collector, minor collector, major collector, neighborhood collector?
it's a multiple choice test, and I don't know the answer. We'll have to look at a map.
If I say it louder, will you?
If you ask 3 times.
What, okay, then I actually have a follow-up
She
question.
may
to that.
be looking right now.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
Well, while he's looking, so if we were to change the designation of that street to a neighborhood street, because it's clearly connected to a neighborhood, would that change the use? So you can drive a gasoline tanker down a neighborhood street right now, 40 of them.
It wouldn't change whether that parcel, so again, we're still at is this use allowed on this parcel? Not, do they have,
I'm not, at this point, I'm not even arguing that, because I think that's an uphill battle. I'm trying to understand what controls we have over a City of Eugene street.
Councilor Grove, so it appears that Bethel Drive is a minor collector, just to answer that question for you. I think you had really mentioned the place where there is the ability for the city to regulate streets is under Chapter 5. And under Chapter 5, there is the ability to regulate or prohibit certain classes of vehicles on certain streets, depending on whether they would cause damage. That's not something we've done, I think, a lot with streets, bridges, definitely. But there are some regulatory abilities within Chapter 5, depending, on what an impact would be.
Well, and then another question, would it be possible to change the designation of that street to a neighborhood street from a neighborhood collector? A residential street, I guess it's called.
I'd have to go back and look at that process. I mean, typically it's pretty prescriptive of the amount of daily traffic and some other factors around density of certain street types. I don't believe that it would really matter necessarily, depending on what section of Chapter 5 you're looking at, whether it was a neighborhood street or.
if we get to that place to talk about it more, you have to realize there's a lot of industrial uses around there that are also using that same road. So there's a lot of ways in which you just have to think about all of the implications of those kinds of thoughts.
I understand that, but aren't most of the industrial applications for that road closer to the Highway 99 side than the Roosevelt side?
There's semis on this map I gave you, so I don't, you can see plenty of them.
I mean, I guess that's something I would appreciate if we could look into that piece. I just want to know what we can do, what our authority is. I think, again, I think it's an uphill battle with the actual railroad site unless we can get them to voluntarily find another spot for it. Even if they have another access point, this is still very close to a residential area, and I mean, that concerns me. Thank you.
Okay, Mike is waiting for a third, Lindsay's waiting for her first. Do you want to go now, or do you want to let Mike go for it?
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, City Manager, and our attorneys and everybody involved. I first heard about this a couple months back, and it's felt at times a little hopeless as we try to navigate all of these different pieces and how we can be impactful. Because I think what we're all in agreement of is that this is not a great fit for this neighborhood. And I've met with the company now a few times to talk about that, how the historical context, the cultural context, and the public safety pieces are just too much. And in meeting with them, I'm glad to hear that, Mayor met with me within last week, and glad to hear that they're maybe potentially willing to make some changes to the site plans based on that feedback, where we're saying this access point within the neighborhood is so impactful to the kids, the school bus routes, just this very family-oriented space. I think as I'm hearing a lot of questions, they told us that they had submitted a traffic study in that process. And so I'm curious about whether we could see that traffic study. They said that they might be willing to send it to us. I haven't seen it yet. And I'm wondering how that 40 trucks kind of permit, like how was that number determined? Because there's another facility going into Millersburg to a transloading facility there. And in Millersburg, they were approved up to 20 trucks a day. And so that kind of got me thinking, how is this very industrial site in Millersburg that was specifically put in there for that purpose, well, a different type of transloading that there's transitioning. How did they get to 20 versus how did we get to 40? Because the difference between 20 trucks and 40 trucks actually is really huge for this neighborhood. So I'm just looking at that.
I don't think that's a number that we gave them. That's a number that came in their proposed project. That's their number, so that must be just what they're imagining. I haven't seen the traffic study, but anything that we have that's been submitted that's public record, you're welcome to review.
Wonderful. Yeah, so they said that they are legally allowed via their permit to have 40 trucks per day. And when I asked them whether they would be counting their trucks on a daily basis, how they would stay accountable to that, they said, oh, well, we have an annual report. We'll submit that data in an annual report. So we tried to ask them clarifying questions on, well, if they're legally able to have 40, what if they went over 40 in one day? Where's the compliance piece in that? And so I think I'd love to see more information about what is that? What does that look like? Because 40 trucks is estimated at 360,000 gallons of fuel, and it's a lot. We've also asked a lot of questions about what is the market? Is this market for the local Eugene market? That also seems like there's a market analysis piece that I would like to see, and they're saying that they're going to come back to us with that information. So, yeah, those are my primary concerns. I have a work session pull out so that we can come back to this topic when we hopefully have more information. So I appreciate you all.
Okay, thank you. Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. I want to ask a question that I think I know the answer to, but I'm going to just make sure I'm right. First of all, when I look at this map, I don't know anything about biofuels, and I don't know anything about fuel loading one way or another, and I know a bit about land use, but that just looks dangerous to me. I mean, it doesn't take a rocket surgeon to figure out that this probably isn't a good idea, right? And so, I know, seeing if you're awake, the railroad tracks were there first, right? Before any of the houses, before the neighborhood, right? Anybody know the answer, or you think maybe I'm right? I don't know how long those tracks have been there, so.
Yeah.
What's that?
The housing was built for workers on the railroad.
Well, it was the city that permitted and decided to allow people to build housing in that place. Am I correct?
I actually don't know if it was county or city. Right. Yeah.
We can look into it, but we would have to.
Yes, somebody permitted the housing to be
Yes.
built there.
Next to existing federal land we don't control and tracks. My larger point is this isn't the only situation that looks potentially dangerous like this around. And I understand the value, certainly to nearby neighbors, of the overlay zones we've talked about in different places. And that's something we should absolutely talk about. But we should talk about a process whereby we talk about where we allow housing to be built, where there's a potential for it to be a dangerous reality nearby, or nearby to county property that we, and in this case, federal property that we may not ever get to control or may not ever become part of the city, that we're gonna have questions about what goes on there. I see that as our job to make sure we're not approving housing to be built next to a potentially dangerous place in the future, because that's our primary job. And especially as we're talking about building more densely and building more, I see this as a danger that's involved in building more densely that we need to be careful about. And I don't know what the answer is for a difference in process right now, but I guess I'm asking staff to consider that. I mean, it doesn't take anything to see that that's probably dangerous. Well, the only way we can avoid that from our standpoint is where we permit housing to be built in the future. So I don't know how to add that to our process, but I really wish we could. Thank you.
Thank you. Randy?
Thank you, Mayor. I'll try and make this short since it's my third round. But, again, when was the track built? The track most likely started out as just a single line through our area. And then the switching yard came after that, and track has continued to be added up to and including the transload proposal. They're laying more track even closer to a residential area. And they're putting one of the more hazardous operations with transloading right next to the neighborhood, which should concern all of us, and I know it does. The other piece, in piggybacking to what Councilor Leach was asking about the Millersburg site, I'm curious if the 20 versus 40 trucks, is that market-driven or is that capacity-driven for the site? That would be an important question I think that we should ask in trying to understand their business decisions. And it's not my idea, but I think it's a good one. Maybe we should put some roundabouts along there. Thank you.
I am quite certain that they are listening to the meeting, so I'm assuming that we'll get answers to all of the things that you've asked. Their communications person was going to.
Okay, thank you. I just, unless anyone else needs to jump in, I just wanted to thank you for providing this briefing and answering these questions. And it just feels as if we have these two big entities, a big company and the railroad, and they are independent and they're making independent decisions, and the well-being of the city of Eugene is sort of not factoring into it. And so I really appreciate all of the effort to sort of find those places in which we might be able to assure safety and maybe a shifting in how this project goes forward. It is really interesting to think about. They've done some market analysis and decided they need this facility in this place at this volume, and we have no idea what that really is. And we don't know how, so it'll be interesting to see the maps as they come forward. And then I just think, I just really, appreciate the comments about the hazards of residential development anywhere close to a railroad. But, this is true all across the country. I mean, we have railroads all across the country. They go through cities, they go through dense neighborhoods. I grew up in the Hudson Valley, and the train runs right along the Hudson River, and the villages run right along the train track. So it's not that it's so unusual to do that. I think in this case, we have a neighborhood that is contiguous not just to the railroad, but to a lot of other industrial sites, and they've been impacted by all of those industrial sites. So we have an obligation now to sort of, that's the legacy. We have an obligation now not to compound that if we can avoid compounding that. And so I think that's, that's the important work. And I just really appreciate the clarity with which you've sort of teased this apart for us and explained it. And because it's very alarming development, and it'd be good to make sure that it could be modified or it could be safer, or we understand it better. So thank you for that. If there are no other questions or comments, we can close this out. Thank you again, and we're adjourned until our next meeting.